Food and the environment are intertwined. How we produce, move, and dispose of food can have negative environmental impacts like greenhouse gas emissions, or on the other hand, it can have really great positive environmental impacts like it has the ability to build soil health and promote biodiversity. So, climate change is one, if not the largest issue facing our community as well as the entire globe. Climate change impacts how we hunt, fish, gather, and produce food through changes in temperature, both on land and in water, as well as increasingly intense weather patterns, as we can even see just looking at the news right now, seeing that Texas has literally frozen over. Um, so today, we are joined by three panelists who will speak on this topic of environment and food.
From my perspective and within the context of the work that I do, when I think about climate change and the food system, I think about the origin story of our food system, how we got here, and particularly the links between settler colonialism and imperial mentalities. And so when I think about our food system, I really want to speak about the ways that the colonial framework and ventures around enclosure, land accumulation, acquisition really gave rise to the dominant food system that we now have today. And so we can see really clearly across time how the rise of settler European farm families, under this so-called gift of land plots that were offered by the colonial state to white European families, along with all of the tools and the seeds and all of that kind of equipment that really gave rise to the sort of capitalist farm family system that has really taken hold here and allowed for the industrial farming and food system to evolve, and especially the development of the sort of capital intensive industrial scale agricultural industries. It really is a product of that kind of colonial system of land acquisition, expansion. And then that itself was built on a whole set of broken treaties, broken promises. And again, that kind of settler mentality of domination. And we can see then, with that occurring within the context of colonial governments who established policies at the same time to suppress and to dismantle indigenous forms of food harvesting, food gathering, food growing all across so-called Canada. And again, these policies included things like the Homestead Act, the Reserve Act, or the reserve system and the pass system. And these all played a really central role in dismantling indigenous nations, food systems, livelihood systems, and then forcing settler food cultures and food production systems and habits upon them in many ways. So I think what I want to say here is how the link that settler colonialism plays in contributing to climate change and ecological degradation within the context of the food system that we have created. And it's not natural, it's very much socially, politically, contextually specific. And so it's really, I think that's what brings me to so much of this work, is understanding that this isn't that we can denaturalize these systems, and they need to be politicized.
I myself, I think I can only speak from the average person's point of view. I haven't spent enough time in this field to speak as an expert, but what is my role in this, and why does this relate to me? And for me, as the average person, I think that's the constant question that comes up, is why are these things that seem so disconnected related to us, and how can we make a difference? Sure. I think the interconnectedness is one of the most important things to consider, because as Sarah mentioned, with all these things in our past, we don't often associate it with the problems that we're currently facing in our present. So it's important to sort of take everything and look at that in context, before we understand how we can tackle it and understand why that matters to us and why we should care to begin with.
Generally speaking, we treat land, water, and natural resources as commodities. How does this impact our relationship on the environment and our understanding of climate change?
So when we think about the way that we relate to and govern land is really central, right? Land is a commodity. It makes it really difficult for people, and my research with farmers has shown this really clearly. It makes it really, really hard. The sort of the economic constructs, especially the ways in which land competition has risen exponentially over the past 10 or 15 years. It makes it really hard for people to behave in ways that prioritize long-term ecological health, well-being, sort of beyond direct economic behaviors. And so land has become, sort of intrinsically speaking, as an ecological system, incredibly neglected in that way, right? Even to speak of it as a natural resource, I think does the same problem that has reinforces the same problems and the same sort of ways of thinking about land that have actually got us here. And I think when we think about land as carrying just economic and profit value, then it becomes limited to that, to one's ability to actually make a profit on it. And then the focus becomes profit seeking or profit making.
So all these different inequities are sort of tied together, and they're largely based on, in my view, they're largely based on the fact that everything has a price. In what we would typically, in an ideal world, would see as a human right to have access to healthy foods, in terms of food justice, everything starts to topple over when you put a price on it, and then it naturally just creates these sort of discrepancies in the access of food, and how that food is distributed to different types of people in different communities.
So commodities, to me, suggest that land, water, and natural resources belong to someone and can be taken, traded, used, and discarded. This is not a sustainable practice. Land, water, and natural resources should be shared in the same way that we share the air. Indeed, we rely on plants, on land, and in water to remove carbon dioxide and generate the oxygen that we share and breathe. 50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from marine algae. In using land, water, and resources as commodities, too often we do not think of the environmental impact. In Canada, we are fortunate to have so much land, water, and natural resources within our borders. It is our responsibility to manage them for the good of the global community. And if we continue to treat natural resources like commodities and keep taking them, that will be detrimental to the environment.
Who is most impacted by climate change?
The same system that we see so clearly exploiting the land in all the ways that we've just discussed, are also so very clearly exploiting temporary migrant farm and food workers. And so when we look at this from a sort of internationalist and imperialist sort of a scope that really understands and takes seriously the role of imperialism, but also, I think it's really, really important to look at the politics of something like migrant farm worker exploitation, because it's Canadian institutions and Canadian governments and enterprises that have played a really long-standing role in dismantling local food systems and land stewardship systems in places like, let's take Mexico, for example, right? Canada and the US played central roles in dismantling local corn production and markets in Mexico, dumping cheap corn, also heavily investing in export-oriented production systems, and trade liberalism in those contexts. And this has radically reorganized food systems in areas of the so-called global south, in Mexico, for instance, and radically shifted power and ownership out of the hands of local people. And so international acquisition of land and systems by North American firms have directly contributed to the dismantling of those systems, leaving those many people and families dispossessed of their land, their homes, their markets, And then those same people are having to relocate to urban areas or participate in migrant labor regimes or programs out of this kind of desperation. And so I just want to again go back to those kinds of structural forces and that kind of economic intrusion that actually has contributed to those kinds of inequities and the inequities that we're seeing now in the in the so-called Canadian food system is very much one that we need to take from a sort of internationalist perspective.
Certain communities, because of their circumstances, because of their low income, because of the communities and the land that they live on, they inevitably have a higher impact due to climate change.
Well, everybody is impacted by climate change. It's a global problem. Death and destruction can occur anywhere in the world. No one is immune from it, but developing nations and the socioeconomically disadvantaged are hardest hit.
And also the context of COVID, I think, is another really stark reminder of the ways that inequities are baked into the food system, creating further inequities for, in this case, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous communities of color, and food insecurity.
What approaches are we as individuals and communities taking to address our food system's impact on climate change? And what initiatives do you see taking place in York Region and beyond to address the environmental impacts of how we produce, consume, and dispose of waste?
I can speak on behalf of our team, which is the Food Fighters GTA. Essentially, this was a project that was launched early August of last year. Because I work in clinical research, I tend to like to see the connections between health and how that's impacted by climate change. In this context, we were looking at the problem of waste disposal in hospitals. So it's something, again, we don't often connect the two together, but in fact, large hospitals like the Toronto General Hospital produce about 1 ton of food waste every single day. And when you think about it, you realize how many patients are sitting in that hospital, how much energy is being used, how much food is going unconsumed. And a lot of it is structurally upheld because of regulations that are put in place, which are understandable to an extent because obviously there are health concerns, there are safety concerns that have to be abided by. So then the problem becomes, how do we sort of mitigate that problem without disturbing the guidelines that have been put in place? So our solution in our case was to tackle the waste disposal component. And initially we tried to look at how we could, repurpose that food waste. Mackenzie Health, in fact, they have a machine called the Orca machine, which sounds pretty interesting. They essentially liquefy food waste to make it so that it doesn't end up in landfills, which is an example of innovation and technology helping to solve that problem. But we as a student group can't really lend investments or technology to the problem. So instead, we tackled the opposite side of the problem, which was in human behavior. So, when we were talking about these problems with Sodexo Canada, which manages all the non-medical things within the hospital, and with Mackenzie Health, they were talking about a lot of social responsibility, initiatives that they had put in place, a lot of investments in different technologies. The issue was that when we talked with hospital staff, a lot of them had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what initiatives were going on in the hospital, and they didn't know how they contributed to it. And so something as simple as sorting waste was going unnoticed. Hospital staff would be disposing of things in random places. And I'm sure, at least at in different places that I've been in universities, the box, it'll say garbage and recycling. And then if you open it up, it's one container. So little problems like that seem to create a disconnect between the organization's motive of having social responsibility and the actual actions that were taking place. So what we decided to do was we decided to target that motivation to actually make people realize that they played a large factor in the social responsibility of Mackenzie Health and the workplace that they were in. So we created a trivia game, which you can access actually and play for free, which essentially tests people's knowledge on not only the initiatives that are going on within their communities, environmental initiatives, but also testing them on their waste sorting knowledge. So for example, where does a styrofoam container go? I think some of us have to sort of think about that before we dispose of it. So that was our solution to sort of targeting that small problem and encouraging change in behavior to be able to create a bigger change in the workplace and in the community as well.
So as individuals, we can certainly reduce our food waste if we only buy the food we need. If we buy frozen food, save food that is almost expired by freezing or cooking it, organizing the fridge better so that nothing goes off because we can't see it. The big one, go by expiry dates rather than best by dates to decide when food is no longer edible. Also, you can do a food audit that monitors how much waste you generate over a number of weeks. I know the York Region Food Network has been doing that. In addition to that, one that I really like is the Earth Rangers Food Waste Mission. It's designed for children and it gets families involved. And I think that's important. Sometimes it's difficult to reach out to the people that really need to hear the message. And sometimes we can get that message to adults through their children. And of course, saving on food waste is a cost savings too, like so much that's involved with adjusting to climate change. And of course, we can put plant food waste into composters, and that all adds nutrients to the soil. We can buy locally to cut down on transport emissions, all good things to do as individuals and as communities. Let me just talk a little bit about Neighbours for the Planet. It's got a web presence, neighboursfortheplanet.ca, and I know Morgan will send out this sort of information after our meeting. Neighbours of the Planet reaches out to those concerned about a green future in a variety of ways through community events. We focus on plant-based food and reducing food waste. Neighbours for the Planet has been working with the York Food Network to reduce food waste in this month's Good Food Challenge. And in a fairly recent development, Neighbours for the Planet is planning to start a climate action and resource centre in Richmond Hill. It's exciting. It'll be a space where the public can go to learn about climate change and what they can do to make a difference. And it's hoped it will feature eco-technology fairs, climate change education for schools and the public, film screenings, conferences, workshops and presentations. Plant-based cooking classes and education on composting will be included, along with things on reducing food waste, regenerative agriculture. And also it's going to be a space to gather for free for local non-profit environmental groups. With Richmond Hill's Blue Dot organisation, at the moment, Neighbours of the Planet is looking at helping multi-residential buildings improve the handling of waste, sending more organic waste to anaerobic digesters. They're the better option actually than composters, and sending less to landfill where it releases methane will help mitigate the climate crisis.
So one thing that I have been really interested in working through and in community with folks is to try to understand what being in good relationship with food and land in the context of where you live, what that can look like. I think about Kim Tallbear's quote, in order to sustain good relations among all the beings that inhabit these lands, we must undercut settler property relations. Instead of killing the Indian to save the man, we must turn the ontological table and really consider what concepts and what structures of settler colonialism have actually done to really erode and harm our relationships to land and food. So I think that's a really, really important step that we can take in our own lives to understand how these kind of internalized frameworks have shaped our approach to food and our way of being on the land or not being on the land, right? How we actually separate ourselves from the spaces that we live and exist and reside on.
What should every person at this event do to further the conversation and their understanding about food and how it relates to the environment?
So I think there's one thing, it's one thing to tell people, what they should be doing to help the environment. It's another thing to help them do it. So I think that would be the key thing to take away, where we need to understand how we can apply those things on a practical level.
A lot of the kinds of behaviors that the consumption behaviors, the rhetoric around sort of make sure that you're buying local, buy this, or don't eat meat and things like that, I think it can serve really similar and kind of problematic functions to actually transfer a lot of the structural harms onto individuals, and then also create the same sort of culture and structures of surveillance onto those who are least economically able to actually make those kinds of decisions, you know, those kinds of food choices. So I think having that sort of surveillance-y, like you know, we all need to, like, you know, vote with our fork and eat this. And I think that I understand it. I understand the impetus and the incentive behind that. But I think in terms of sort of turning that ontological table, I think it creates further harms and further structures around surveillance.
Bring others into the conversation. Raise your voice. Don't be afraid. For a lot of people, I think they find it difficult for that very first time to actually say something they're concerned about. And it can be writing a letter to the paper, phoning your MP. There's 3 levels of government you can work with: municipal, provincial, and federal. Keep the pressure on. Raise your voice, please. Don't be afraid. And I can tell you that MPs, if you contact an MP directly, that means a lot to them. That carries a lot of weight.